Hello and welcome to tonight's webcast, Review of Popular Diets, a deep dive into two opposite diets, low-fat, plant-based, and ketogenic with Laura Laval. Laura Laval is a registered dietitian and nutritionist who has years of experience in hospital-based dietetics, as well as extensive experience in integrative medicine settings, including in clinic. She's extremely knowledgeable in all things dietetics, and I know you'll enjoy her presentation today. I'm Libby Bricker, your moderator. I'll facilitate the question and answer session, so please raise your hand or use the chat box if you have a question. You can access the recording on the blog at metaboliccode.com/blog. Also, if you're not already a Metabolic Code System subscriber, please consider registering for the demo hosted by A4M next Tuesday, March 15th at 7 p.m. Eastern at metaboliccode.com/events. I will let Laura take it from here. Give me one moment while I switch the screen.
Okay, are we all good? You can see my screen?
Yes, looks great.
Okay. Well, we want to thank everyone for taking time out of busy schedules for joining us tonight for my review of two more popular diets. This has been a popular webinar, I will say, going over popular diets. And tonight I chose to do a review of low-fat plant-based diets and ketogenic diets. The reason I chose these two diets is because they're both growing in popularity. And it's interesting to me that they couldn't be more opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of the macronutrient intake. So anyway, with that being said, I'll just plunge straight ahead and we will go through and kind of tell you what it's all about with these two diets. So, one thing by way of background, if you've joined me on my other popular diet review webinars, you know that how I try to approach this is I let you know where the diet fits in the categories of different diets that are out there, and then I discuss what the diet actually is, the nuts and bolts of it, why it might be used by people, the health issues that it may help address, what it won't address, problems you might encounter on the diet, and then I'll be mentioning and referring to past webinars here and there, so bear with me on that if you haven't listened in on some of the other ones. I do try to give enough background that you understand. So the diet categories, how I do it is there are calorie-controlled diets that are things like, Jenny Craig, Nutrisystem, Weight Watchers. And so anytime I discuss a calorie-controlled diet, we're discussing it in that context. Those diets tend to be somewhat higher in carb. You can see here 50 to 60% carb, a little bit low on protein, and moderate to low on fat. Vegetarian, vegan, raw diets, those all fall into the plant-based diet category, which is much higher in carb. And depending upon how it inverse ratios with the fat, it'll be lower in fat or maybe slightly higher depending on how the people do it, but they tend to be always pretty low in protein. Anti-inflammatory diets are things like Mediterranean DASH diet. Those are also fairly high in carb. And then there's a broad range of low-carb diets from Zone to Atkins to South Beach to, many, many, many different versions. And they'll range anywhere from 10 to 40% of the calories coming from carb. So a very low-carb diet is one that is 10% carb or under, and 20 to 25% protein, and very high in fat. And that's where the ketogenic diet fits. So we are dealing with our vegetarian category and our very low carb diet category tonight. When I discuss the diets, I always discuss them not just in terms of weight loss, because there's a whole lot more going on with people and their health than just, losing a few pounds. We're concerned about the type of weight they lose, And we're concerned about disease risk factors and things like controlling inflammation and immune response. So always looking an eye toward gut health and immune response. And these things together then will be what ultimately better supports more optimal health. Okay, going right in, let's talk about vegetarian. How does it compare? How is it different? Is it the same thing? I know when plant-based diets came out, I was a little confused. I was like, oh, so isn't that just vegetarian? So here I will be happy to explain what exactly the story is. A plant-based diet is almost vegetarian. It's and it could be vegetarian. So what it is basically a different way of encouraging people to eat more plant foods. Rather than saying, let's all become vegetarian, it's this idea that we would all be a lot healthier if we would just manage to eat a lot more plant-based foods and fewer, refined processed foods are really what are, hurting people. Very low quality, processed, high fat, high white flour, all the time, those types of foods. That's what's making America unhealthy. So it's this notion that we really need to be eating more plant foods. And it doesn't necessarily mean that for the rest of our life we have to commit to this staunch thing of never ever eating another animal protein. So that's the idea behind a plant-based diet. Vegetarian diets are plant-based diets, but to varying degrees of exclusion of animal protein. Plant-based diet is just a commitment to eating more plant-based foods and occasionally going ahead and eating some animal protein if you want to. So I like the idea of plant-based diets. I think that we don't necessarily have to say I'm never going to eat another animal protein. Just so that you know the nomenclature, flexitarians is a term for people who eat largely plant-based foods, largely vegetarian, but eat occasional animal protein. So it's two different terms for the same thing. Pescatarians means that it's a person that eats plant-based and they will eat animal protein, but only fish. And so that's called a pescatarian. I had one of those in my office this week, actually, or last week. So again, in general, on vegetarian and plant-based, there's an emphasis on minimally processed foods from plants. And again, modest amounts of some type of animal protein, whether it's fish and or other lean meats or low-fat dairy or just dairy, it doesn't necessarily have to be low-fat. But red meat only sparingly. That, in other words, is kind of like the Mediterranean diet. Now, plant-based, if it's going to be done well, and according to what the literature shows would be healthiest, we would tend to lower the fat intake somewhat, although, plant-based doesn't necessarily automatically imply low fat. But there are very low-fat versions of vegetarian diets out there. Bottom line, what we're getting across with this, macronutrient-wise, the fat content can vary, but it will be high carb and tend to be very low, much lower in protein, typically. So this was just to reinforce that a plant-based diet is pretty close to a Mediterranean diet in guidelines, taking in all these plant foods, with the only difference being if you do animal protein every day versus animal protein just sometimes. But overall, pretty similar. So these are some of the very low-fat plant-based diets that are out there. The Esselstyn diet, which says eat no oils whatsoever, not even olive oil. It only allows a few walnuts for the source of omega-3s, no avocado, and it's no animal protein at all. So this would be vegan and not fall in this category of plant-based. It is plant-based, but it's skewing any and all intake of any animal protein. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because these are some of the plant-based diet, vegetarian diets that are out there, such as Ornish, has actually moved now to being a little bit more liberal and allowing foods on a spectrum. So it'll say, it has lists of foods that says these are the foods that you can eat all the time, like your leafy greens, your fruits, vegetables, things like that. It used to limit nuts and avocado, but now has liberalized that and even has moved to allowing some dairy, but although they specify fat-free still in this diet approach, and egg whites. So Ornish now basically fits the definition for a plant-based diet and not necessarily being so strictly non-animal protein in its newest version. So I just wanted people to be aware of that. Okay, the assertion for no animal protein at all is that it damages arteries, although there's very little evidence to that end. But I do point out to people that one of the studies that I saw that was pointed to as proof of this was this one, where they fed high animal protein diet to mice, and the vascular effects were significant, the artery damage. But again, I always have to question, this is mice. They are supposed to eat mostly grains, and I can imagine that if you're feeding a species a diet that is not their natural diet, that it's not going to have good effects on their body. So the point being, the evidence, in my opinion, right now is thin on that particular point. So I don't think there's a strong rationale for being extremely strict on the animal protein elimination. So if I am going to see somebody tending toward a plant-based diet, I would rather see them go toward the plant-based versus vegan that says no animal protein at all whatsoever. I just don't think there's enough evidence to say that that's necessary. So this is a study that was done, a few years back, but I really, really like this study. I think this is a point that is often missed with people. So one of the things that I will say about vegetarian diets, I've already pointed out, they're very high carb, and I'm going to go through more of the anatomy of the diet in a moment. But what this brings up is, if you're doing a high carb, plant-based, or vegetarian diet, should it be low in fat or not? Well, this Gaziano researcher that did this study said what the body really can't seem to handle is eating a lot of carbs at the same time as we're eating, having a lot of intake of fat. The body can't handle that. The reason is that, especially if it's plant oils, they specifically pointed out omega-6s. I don't know if it's the same thing with animal proteins, but there's also a lot of fructose intake. These two substances tie up a certain pathway that processes fats in the liver. And what it does is it shuts down HDL production and causes triglyceride production to go up. So like the worst combination is, if you think of high fructose foods, we're thinking of fruits in particular. So if you're a fruitarian or, eat a lot of fruit as part of your vegetarian diet, not necessarily fruitarian, but, and you eat plant oils, you're going to have a tendency to push yourself towards increased triglycerides. And we know that when we have high triglycerides and low HDL, and that higher ratio on that, that's a super strong predictor of coronary artery disease. So my point here with this is to let you know that if you have clients that really are adamant that they're going to eat very low animal protein, they're going to eat vegetarian or plant-based, I would counsel them to make sure that they don't overdo it on too many oils at the same time they're eating all those high carbs. Because that's not a good scenario on our body chemistry at all. So make sure that they understand that. And there are opposing views on this, level of should it be low fat or can we be more liberal? And this is, you know, information that came out of Harvard. Walter Willett and Frank, who are two very high-profile nutrition researchers, and they did exhaustive reviews of the literature, trying to look at this whole issue with dietary fat intake and does it increase risks. And basically, they've kept on top of all the literature with this for quite some time, and they found that after looking at quite a number of studies, 147 to be exact, that the lowering the percentage of your calories that you take in from fat does not really lower heart disease risks significantly. What they recommend doing is use plant oils as your main source of dietary fat versus saturated fat, because of data that came out of the Nurses' Health study that found that increased saturated fat intake did increase risks of heart disease. So, you know, that was a large study, and that was a pretty well done study. They also were some of the people to really make sure to raise the awareness that we need to take in adequate omega-3. So these were early people saying we've got to get that anti-inflammatory omega-3s, and in fact, what I like is they have been very clear the best sources of omega-3s are from fish and fish oil, not from plant sources. Now, what the plant-based diet, you know, vegan advocates point out is that, you know, lots of plant foods contain fatty acids. Lots of dark leafy greens contain some omega-3s. So when you're eating plant-based, you're not creating supposedly inflammation from other sources, so you don't necessarily need quite as much omega-3, and they're saying that you're getting it in your plant foods. However, the researchers at Harvard, as I said, have said, well, what the problem is the flax and walnuts and these other plant-based sources of omega-3s require the body to be able to do a conversion process that we're really not very efficient at doing. So very little of that omega-3 that you take in flaxseed and walnut gets converted to DHA and EPA. And so they really strongly recommend getting those foods from, getting those fats from fish, or if you don't eat fish, from fish oil. And what they recommend to keep the diet anti-inflammatory is swapping out the, you know, the types of carbs that Americans typically eat, you know, white flours, lots of sugars, all of that, for whole grains, fruits and vegetables being the primary carb sources. So what are we looking at here? With a plant-based diet, are we going to have some health risk reductions, or are we not? Are there some advantages to plant-based diet? Is it a diet that people should consider? You know, by far and away, there is no doubt that high intake of plant foods improves health and lowers health risks. However, that's why I like the movement towards this plant-based diet thing, where we're not necessarily saying that we're never ever going to eat another animal protein, because I'm going to take a few slides here to just examine, would we really lower risks if we all became vegetarian, or are there still some questions and concerns on the diet? So that's the purpose of the next few slides. You know, a lot of the studies on vegetarian diet are from early Seventh-day Adventist trials, and those were the studies that began to get people looking at vegetarian diets, saying, wow, because they really seem to have lowered health risks. Well, what they began to find out as we got a little bit more sophisticated with our you know, researcher techniques, we found out that, you know, there were other things that could be lowering risk for Seventh-day Adventists, such as the fact that they don't smoke much, they weren't big drinkers. They didn't drink coffee and tea. They have lower stress because they have a lot of community support within their religion. So those types of things were not controlled for, versus newer studies like the EPIC trials in European countries that really exhaustively looked at all sorts of dietary habits to see if they could identify risks from eating processed meats, for example, versus eating vegetarian, high fat, low fat, all these things. And what they found out was that there was a somewhat reduced, pretty significant reduced risk of ischemic heart disease following a vegetarian diet. 17 to 32% reduced risk is no small potatoes. And I will say that what was nice, these studies were up to date and they controlled for these other factors like smoking and exercise and alcohol and all of that. And the one thing that I will say is fairly consistent in the literature is that vegetarian diets do seem to reduce risk for heart disease. So I can't deny that in the studies. And especially you're going to have lowered risk on a healthy, well-done vegetarian diet is certainly going to be, you could even probably half-hearted do it, and it's going to be lower risk than an average American diet, which a Western diet is, high in, lunch meat, salami, bacon, red, conventionally raised red meat, beef. Lots of sweets, lots of desserts, French fries, and a lot of white flour, So that is a recipe for disaster. It's very low fiber, no fruits, no vegetables. The average American still isn't doing great on fruit and vegetable intake. So naturally, when you look at a vegetarian diet in comparison to a standard American diet or the SAD diet, it's going to lower risks. Of course it would. So now they're looking at these diet patterns and they adjust for the other factors in these studies, and sometimes they do a better job of adjusting for all those factors, but certainly in contrast to a Western diet, a vegetarian diet would lower risks. I don't know anybody that would argue that it wouldn't. These are just, again, the different categories of vegetarian diets. If we're talking of lacto-ovo vegetarian that consumes little milk, cheese, and or eggs, that technically also could be considered a plant-based diet. So just to point that out. Now, the big issue with vegetarian diet, like any other diet, is that it is not so much what's on paper of how a diet should be done. It's how people actually choose to do it. And so what you will see, I actually, have found that a good number of people who come in that say they're eating vegetarian, they're what I say they're not a vegetarian because they really hardly eat any vegetables. They're a carbitarian. And I actually had a client last week that fit this category. She got up, went to the coffee shop, got coffee and a pastry. She snacked on candy during the day at work. Her lunch, she thought this was healthier. She did whole grain bread with a nut butter and berries, and then maybe a little more candy or cookies or something in the afternoon, and then maybe a salad or something for dinner. So not very much animal protein, but certainly not a healthy diet. Technically, would it fit the definition of plant-based? I guess if you want to count, white flours as plant-based. So, my point here is really, you do have to interview clients. You have to see what they're actually doing. You can't just take it at face value if they're saying they're vegetarian. You really want to see exactly what they're doing. If they're self-guided, as in this this first bullet point here, it could be all over the map. And just so you have knowledge, if somebody's following an Ornish, that is pretty low fat, but now adapted, and the Esselstyn is the one that is no plant oils at all and no animal protein at all. Technically, these, these all kind of fit plant-based. They are plant-based, but they're different versions. And like I said, plant-based versus vegan or vegetarian implies that it's not going to be this long-term commitment to never eating another animal protein. So what are some of the issues that could come up in plant-based diets? Depending on how strictly a person does a vegan or vegetarian diet, they are going to be at risk for certain nutrient deficiencies. The omega-3s in particular are very low in vegetarians and vegans. B12 is extremely low in vegetarians and even lower in vegans, and calcium intake and things like zinc. B12, we see that all the time. We see vegetarians coming in that have elevated homocysteine, and that's inversely correlated with B12. So we know B12 is one of the B vitamins that keeps homocysteine levels down. So where a person on a plant-based diet might have an advantage over a more strict vegetarian is the fact that they don't, when they're including animal proteins, animal foods are your best sources of B12, and they don't have to worry as much about homocysteine and B12 deficiencies. So I'm actually really happy when people choose to do plant-based on this level where they are okay with eating some animal proteins here and there. Fish to get in those omega-3s. It's awesome, and I'm always really pleased when I see it. Or even if it's a lacto-ovo-vegetarian where they're eating eggs now and then, that saves them on the B12 issue. So plant-based is actually better in my mind because it helps avoid some of these nutrient deficiencies. This is a study that was done that was stating that, the average American really high-fat meal causes endothelial dysfunction, so an impaired ability of your blood vessels to expand and contract. And, this kind of comes in, maybe has some pertinence with the ketogenic diet too, which I'll get to later, because if it's just an average person or an average practitioner, someone with some medical knowledge that sees these types of headlines, because this study got really big headlines, and they're going to say, oh, that ketogenic diet, the problem with it is it's very high fat and it could impair vasoactive dilation. Well, don't necessarily take that kind of thing at face value, because in this particular study, the meal that was studied was a sausage and egg McMuffin. So what got me was, why did they equate that with just being high fat? That is so many things besides a high fat meal. What that is a meal that's very high in refined white flour in that muffin. Yes, high fat from the sausage and the cheese and things like that, but this is the exact meal that Gaziano was referring to in that study that I showed you earlier about the high fat and the high carb all at the same time, plus very high sodium. So I don't know how you can generalize this to all high-fat meals. Okay, vegetarian diets, looking at cardiovascular. Again, fairly consistent in the literature that it lowers risk for cardiovascular disease compared to meat eaters. Again, keep in mind, they're not always just comparing it to a person that's a healthy diet that happens to eat some meat. They're comparing it to the standard Western diet. And on average, about 20% risk reduction. One of the things that always concerns me in a comparison of, weight status and things like that is that I've never seen them compare body fat percent with lean mass in these, and I'd like to see that get done in some studies, and I think it would be interesting to see how that plays out. This is a study. The reason why I included this is because we have, if we're looking for an evidence base that's truly consistent to rationalize going to vegetarian, vegan, and or plant-based, these types of studies are out there showing that when they compare vegan to a regular calorie-controlled diabetic diet, the vegans lost more weight, had improved insulin sensitivity, had modest reductions in lipids and things like that. Big, very more improvements in hemoglobin A1C. This was a 20-week study. But what I'm going to tell you is this is a 20-week study. So I'll be getting to a slide in a couple of slides that comes up with the exact opposite conclusion than this based on large epidemiological information. But I'll discuss that in a moment. So, one of the concerns about, and in fact, I can just go to this. This is what I'll show you. The vegetarian diet, countries that have very high rates of people following vegetarian diet also have very high rates of diabetes. We know that India, for example, has one of the highest rates of diabetes. So do some Middle Eastern countries and Asian. And this, again, is a study and a discussion that was done by Frank, who I really follow his work and respect and admire it, because he's a voice saying, hey, this doesn't make sense. This very, very high carb intake, it's not a walk in the park. It's very high glycemic. And so he's out there as a voice saying, watch out, not all people can reduce diabetes risk on vegetarian diets. If you're going to follow a vegetarian diet, it must be calorie and glycemic controlled. He is saying, look, we know this glycemic factor affects heart disease risk. So it's not just a matter of, oh, vegan and vegetarian diets are a path to not getting diabetes. There is a lot of data to the contrary of that. So knowing that, these researchers said, that we probably should look at trying to lower the carb content of vegetarian diets, and let's compare that to a higher carb vegetarian diet and see what happens. So this carb and protein thing, we know protein is protective against glycemic response. And so what they did was they managed to do a vegetarian diet that calculated out to 26% of the calories from carb and 31% of the calories from protein. And that is really hard to do on a vegan diet. So what they did, the foods that they used to get that protein up were wheat gluten, which in the form of seitan, this is a food, what it is, it's baked wheat gluten, and then soy. And so that made the calories from fat at about 43%. Then they did a regular higher carb, lower protein version of a vegetarian diet. And in comparison, both groups lost weight, a little more on the low carb, which would be what we expect, and this is where I'm referring back to all the old webinars that I've done where I've shown you the comparison of weight loss on lower carbohydrate diets is always more, and that held true in this study. And there was a 10% reduction in lipids with the low carb vegan group and not so much in the other. So the 10-year calculated risk for coronary heart disease was reduced in both groups just due to the weight loss alone. But there were greater improvements and decreases in the lipid profile in the low carb group. There were only there were decent decreases in LDL, total cholesterol, and ApoB, and just slight drops in triglycerides on the low carb group. The HDL didn't budge much. So the thing that I'd like to point out, this was a very difficult diet to do. There was a very high dropout rate. But it did prove the point that a vegetarian diet can needs to be watched on the carb intake to protein ratios. Okay, so this was a study that was done with lacto-ovo, and they just tried to look at a person that does a low-fat, calorie-controlled diet compared to a vegetarian diet, and they even allowed milk and cheese in here. And so what they said was, did the meat itself provide any, not being in there, did that provide any advantage? And the answer was, no, it did not. So there really wasn't any big outcome from just, eliminating meat. It did nothing, actually. So, the point here is these are both pretty high-carb diets. The low-fat, calorie-controlled is a high-carb. A vegetarian diet is a high-carb. You take the meat out on that lacto-ovo. You still allow some eggs and milk products, things like that. They calorie-controlled both of them. They both lost a little bit of weight, and they didn't have any changes in the lipid profile. Okay. Now, the reason why I put this slide in here, vegetarian diets and cancer, there is a huge perception out there due to discussions all over the place, online and whatnot, that there's a very big risk reduction by eating vegetarian in terms of your risk for cancer. And actually, when you look at the true data on the studies, the risk reduction for cancer from going vegetarian is modest to slight, so modest at best. It's not a super strong risk reduction, as you would think when you look at the literature. The China study, while it says that, lower animal protein intake was associated with lower cancer, it really was not a real well-done study. The data, you can read a review about that at Science-Based Medicine, so put that out of your mind as being a strong, strong study showing cancer risk reduction. It really didn't. Okay. One of the things I like to point out, because I'm talking about, okay, if a person does vegetarian diet or plant-based diet and they stick with it really strongly, what are some of the potential things to look out for? One of the things that has been found, and this is not widely known, this study looked at the effects of vegetarian diets on immune response. Don't know what made them think to look at this, but they did. And they found that vegetarians had significantly lower white and red blood cell counts and significantly lower phagocytosis activity in their monocytes and granulocytes in the older vegetarian population in particular in that study, but then another one found it in younger vegetarians. So, it looked like really significantly suppressed, T lymphocyte response. So one of the things that I have actually seen in the real life world is that over time, not so much in the first year or two, but over time of doing vegetarian diet long term, you might start to see clients experiencing more illness, more prone toward cold and flu. And what would the reason be? The only thing that I can hypothesize is that, actually the human digestive system does a very good job digesting animal protein. The high acidity in the stomach breaks down animal protein really well, and a lot of people don't realize that. And actually humans, the reason why so many plant substances are fiber for us, fiber means substances in plant foods that we don't digest. They don't digest because we don't have the enzymes to digest a lot of these plant cell substances. And so that means if you're not digesting them, you're not extracting all the nutrients, the protein, and everything from those foods. This is very different from a gorilla. A gorilla is, and chimpanzees are our nearest, in terms of our evolutionary things, if you go by evolutionary theories. And they have extremely long hind guts. They eat a lot of plant matter, a lot of vegetation. They hold on, that stays in their hind gut for a really long time. They have all the enzymes to break it down. They get every nutrient and protein out of it. Humans do not. And so our immune system gets built up with with proteins. Proteins are what make up our immune cells, every tissue in our body, including immune cells. And I think it may simply come down to not having as much zinc and not having as much, utilizable amino acids from our protein sources, possibly. So watch out for that in people. Now this, to me, would tend to be, again, less of an effect if somebody does plant-based diet versus more strict vegetarian or vegan, because they are including animal proteins here and there. Okay, one of the things that you would think would be a no-brainer, but this was another I think Neil Barnum study, and they did high-fiber vegan diets and Geico employees, so it was a corporate wellness program. And they found decent weight loss and decent improvements in LDL, and their people with diabetes noticed that identifier there had improvements in blood glucose. So the point here being they didn't just put them on vegan, they made sure it was high fiber. So that would definitely be something that I would want to mention to people, not only along with when you're doing vegan or plant-based, that you try to watch the glycemic impact of the foods, but you make sure you get in enough fiber. Now, this is the key point that I want to show you. To tell you, to drive it home, how high carb an average plant-based or vegetarian diet would be, when you're eating a lot of grains, so pastas, rice, when you're eating a lot of starchy vegetables, potatoes, sweet potatoes, all of those, you're eating a lot of fruit. These are beans. These are very high glycemic impact plant foods. So then you balance it with the vegetables, and nuts and seeds and avocados and oils and things like that. But the vast majority of your calories are coming from those very high carb foods. So this was a client that I had come in last week, and the intake was 2,380 calories. 336 grams of carb in that diet, because it's all of these foods that I'm telling you. And this person was actually pretty health conscious and doing a pretty good job with the diet, but just by nature, it's a very high carb diet. So that was 56% of the calories from carb. She ate quite a bit of nuts and seeds and used avocado and different, like almond oil and things like that. So the fat was a little higher than the average vegetarian diet, but it was 11% protein. Now, so happened that this was a young teenager who was in track, so burning this all off and controlling her weight and all of that. But we were just looking to see what the overall calorie intake, and I also actually analyzed this diet for iron, and the iron intake was about 15 milligrams per day. Anyway, just driving home the point that it's very high carb. Now, this girl was pescatarian, so plant-based, ate fish now and then. Well, on her days when she had salmon, that upped the protein considerably and took the carbs down. So that was that's how just a little bit more protein intake impacts that breakdown. Okay, one of the things that is out there as a kind of a big deal is that if you're going to eat too much animal protein, you'll tend to have higher rates of osteoporosis. So actually, again, this is a promise or a thought that's out there that really is not supported strongly in the literature. Actually, what is seen in the literature is that as people get older, they're better off to take in some animal protein because those proteins build the matrix of bone. So it's not just minerals you need in your bone matrix. You need minerals and protein. That's what makes up that the center support of our bones. So there's actually better bone density. There's also a pretty strong trend in the literature that vegan diets are actually associated with lower bone mineral density. So that is not a proven advantage at all. This is a study slide that I continue to bring up because one of the issues that we have noticed in the literature on very high carb, lower protein diets, such as the American Heart Association diet, which is just a calorie-controlled, low-fat diet, is that when people limit their calories and they lose weight on these high carb diets, they do lose weight. But there's a trend that is seen in that It's not always from body fat. So if they're not losing fat, that means they're losing lean muscle. So that's why I would like to see more work being done looking at body composition among vegetarian and high carb, plant-based diet eaters. I don't want to discuss this. This was another endothelial thing, but actually what this was, if it's high fat that is supposed to clamp down that endothelial function, then that means a low carb, high fat diet should make endothelial dysfunction become worse. And this was a 12-week study that looked at a comparison of a high carb versus low carb and found that the flow-mediated dilation in the blood vessels increased on a low carb diet from 5.1% to 6.5%. So higher fat isn't, the only thing that impacts flow dilation in blood vessels. In the low-fat diet group, so this is a high-carb diet group, the flow decreased. So those studies that point to, Western diets and, fats and all this, and again, this is going to come up and, be an issue that I'll discuss. This will be pertinent to ketogenic diet coming up. Okay. This is slides that I've discussed before that, energy-restricted diets, we tend to lose lean mass. So the reason I bring this up is because if we're doing plant-based diet and we know that we have to watch the glycemic impact of the foods that we eat within that, and we know that according to Frank Hu, ideally a plant-based vegetarian diet should be calorie controlled, then we are looking at, okay, what's going to happen with muscle and lean mass. So that, again, is another one of my warnings is, people follow these diets, take a BIA on them, take a, an ultrasound and measure, percent body fat and lean. And try to get, if they're going to stick with not doing too much animal protein, try to find other ways to get, the protein intake up with protein powders or something. Okay. I'm going to go past a lot of this now. Just summarize on plant-based diets. Yes, good to eat a lot of plant food for better health all the way around. But when it comes to being vegan or vegetarian or plant-based, I would actually far prefer people do plant-based so that we get in good sources of B12. Be aware some people on that high-carb diet may gain weight. It's not a definite path to no heart disease, diabetes, or cancer. And in fact, in integrative world, we know that high-carb can exacerbate gut, yeast issues. Look for immune depressive effects over time. And, the big thing that I see with a vegetarian diet, and I know I've tried it, is that, people tend to be a little hungrier, they need to eat more, and that's when they tend to go to those high-grain, high-starch foods to feel more full. Well, that's the very thing that, according to some of the literature, we shouldn't do. We've got to keep that glycemic impact down. I don't mind vegetarian approaches in people that have that muscle and they're overweight, but they're very stocky and muscular in addition to being overweight with too much fat. So sometimes a vegetarian diet can help people lose muscle and fat, which in some cases can be an advantage for certain body types. But, maybe do it for a couple years and then over time, go back up to a little bit more animal protein if the people are open to that. But that's a summary on it. Okay. All right. Again, these are the nutrient issues that will be helped if they do consume some animal protein, so that's good. That's why I like plant-based versus more strict vegetarian diets. I discussed the protein digestibility. The other thing is, just because someone's doing vegetarian doesn't mean that they can't be impacted by, food sensitivities and immune responses to allergens in food. So I still do elimination diet process with people even if they're following vegetarian. I had a vegan a few weeks ago, and we eliminated wheat and gluten to try to figure out if this was causing some of her stomach pain issues. So, there's that still is an issue, and we still explore it. Okay, when it comes to low-carb diets as a category, this is definitely where ketogenic diets fit. They're very low carb and very high fat. So this is exactly the anatomy of a true ketogenic diet. Ketogenic diets were developed initially as a way to treat epilepsy or people with other seizure disorders. At some point, some people figured out that seizures seem to be triggered by high activity in the brain, which gets elevated from high glucose intake. Glucose crossing the blood-brain barrier causes excitability for some reason. So when I learned about ketogenic diets, it was years ago in my dietetics internship. We used them I worked in a children's hospital, and we used them for children with epilepsy. And they worked very well. Now they're becoming more known, and they're used for cancer. They're also used for Alzheimer's. And there's not a good bit of evidence in them being wildly effective for cancer. I hope that evidence might accumulate over time. But they do seem to be pretty effective for people with Alzheimer's, because they're bypassing the need for glucose in the brain and allowing fats to provide energy. So anyhow, the anatomy of a ketogenic diet is that it's 70% fat, so that's very, very high fat, 20% protein, and 10% carbs, so that's really low carb. It's on the opposite end of the spectrum. That's why I said these were two diets too that would be interesting to compare. So what you do with a ketogenic diet is, if you're doing it as a true ketogenic, you calculate the calorie needs for the person based on their height and weight and age and everything, and then you calculate 70% of those calories and convert that into how many fat grams, etc. So I had a client a couple of years ago, a very petite woman, and she needed ketogenic diet. Her practitioner wanted to use it. She was in cancer treatment. And so when we did those calculations, it came out to only 30 grams of carb, which is very, very low, 93 grams of fat, and 60 grams of protein. Now remember, this is not 30 grams of carb just from high glycemic foods. This is from vegetables, from any source. So it really limits your ability to eat. You can't eat a really huge salad, for example, or if you do, that's all you're going to have. So if you break down this 30 grams of carb, 1/2 cup of cooked and 1 cup of raw vegetables is a serving. And this client liked vegetables, so we broke it down so that she knew if she had most days where she wanted to eat a good bit of non-starchy vegetable, she knew how much she could have, or if she wanted to have a fruit or a starchy food, a little bit of potato or rice or something, she could have 1 high glycemic food, fruit or starch, and 3 non-starchy vegetables, and that made up her intake then. So the way this breaks down, she did a shake in the mornings and added a lot of fat, because one of the side effects of a very high fat ketogenic diet is constipation. You want to make sure that you try to get fiber sources in there. You can't do it all with with your vegetables and fruit anymore. So you really have to go toward using things like seeds, chia seeds, flax seeds, stuff like that. And this was how her lunch broke down. It was only 2 ounces of protein and a lot of added fats here. And again, a little bit of protein. That's not very much. You should weigh out 3 ounces of a turkey burger sometime. You'll be surprised how much it is. But we cooked it. We had her cook it in oil. We did a broccoli slaw with a mayo to get more fats in there. And I gave her a recipe for cucumbers with tahini. So sesame seed, very high in oil. So plus the tahini itself, and we really got the fat intake up there, and this did the job. So how did she feel on this diet? Not the greatest, to be honest. She just definitely noticed a little lack of overall vitality or energy, I would say, even though we were really trying to get good nutrients in here. But she did lose a lot of weight. She was a breast cancer case. She had gone vegetarian thinking that she was doing the right thing. And, for breast cancer cases, it's really crucial to manage the weight. But on vegetarian, her weight kept going up and up and up. And definitely the weight came back off on the ketogenic. So, what it is it's the same old story. Very low carb diets allow our insulin to stay down and allow us to access fat stores for, for energy. So we burn fat. A ketogenic diet, you're definitely, as the name implies, you're going after ketosis. So if you do it as a true ketogenic diet, you will not even eat too much protein. The reason being, amino acids, there are 4 different types of amino acids that can get converted to glucose. And so if you eat over 20% of your diet as protein, some of those amino acids in the protein will convert to glucose. So that means you won't stay in a constant ketotic state. You'll go in and out. So is that good or is it bad? Well, in terms of using a ketogenic diet for epilepsy, it was interesting. This study found that an Atkins-type diet is a high-fat, low-carb diet, but it's also higher in protein. So meaning if someone with epilepsy followed Atkins, they would still be ketotic but not constant. They might go in and out. And what they found was that it still worked for a lot of people for managing epilepsy. So it was kind of nice to know this because it allowed people to eat a little more protein. They didn't have to eat such low amounts, and let them realize if they're in and out of ketosis a little bit, they could still manage their seizures. So it was a good study. But when it comes to other people, the average person using ketogenic diet for weight management, just as a diet to follow long term, here's a study that sheds a little bit of light on whether it's a good idea or not. So this compared ketogenic diet low carb to non-ketogenic low carb. Okay, so true ketogenic high fat versus more of an Atkins-y type diet with higher protein. And what they found was that both diets were effective for weight loss. Interesting, though, that the non-ketogenic diet group actually lost more weight than the ketogenic. And the fat loss was greater. So the weight that you want to lose. So being in ketosis all the time isn't necessarily an advantage for weight and fat loss. Both diets did a good job of maintaining resting energy expenditure, which is huge because that tends to go down on most other diets for weight loss, and insulin sensitivity improved in both. Now, beta-hydroxybutyrate is a ketone. And what they did was they measured this ketone in the blood of the people in this study. And so they found out in the ketogenic group, low-carb ketogenic diet group, that truly they were in ketosis. And their ketones were, this marker, were 3.6 times higher than they were in the other group. And they also found that the higher the ketones, the more they tended to have elevated LDL. So this is something I want to mention. In real life, on my many, many years of doing low-carb diets, I have found that being higher in fat intake, low carb, there was a subset of people that had LDLs increase on the diet. Most people, lipids improved, but you had some people where, while total cholesterol might come down a little bit, their LDL actually went up. And, yes, it might be the large fluffy particle. Yes, we can have discussions that, maybe we don't need LDL levels to be as low as conventional medicine is trying to get people down to with statins and all that. No, we probably, from a health perspective, total health perspective, I think there are risks to being too low on LDL actually. But we can't deny that LDL isn't a risk factor in heart disease. It is. When you have elevated LDL, you're going to have more capability for more of that LDL to become oxidized and therefore plaque forming. So I think we do need to control it to a certain extent. So it was just interesting that the ketosis diet, in that group, there were an increase in LDL in 5 subjects and a decrease in only 4. In the non-ketogenic low-carb diet, LDL only increased in 2 people and decreased in 8. So that was a big difference there between ketogenic and non-ketogenic, is the effect on LDL. And the other thing I think people need to be aware of is the fact that ketogenic low-carb diet group had greatly elevated arachidonic acid, and the ratio of arachidonic went up, and eicosapentaenoic acid went down, so that ratio of inflammation increased in the ketogenic diet group. They happened to measure vigor and happiness and energy and all that, and they found that that all rated much higher in the non-ketogenic. So if I were going to choose a low-carb diet approach for, weight loss and just overall health, I truly would not choose a ketogenic diet. I would choose a non-ketogenic low-carb, where you can have much more liberalized, non-starchy vegetables. You can, you don't limit protein, So ketosis diets that are out there, ketogenic diets, evaluate, are they true ketogenic, or are they more just saying that it's an Atkins type where they're going to be in and out of ketosis? That's a big differentiation point. The other thing is be aware that very high fat constipation can become a problem. People can have more issues with gallbladder problems, gallstones, and become intolerant of the high fat intake, more, they'll burp more, things like that, just indigestion that can come from not dealing well with all the fat. So those are side effects of, these types of diets that can come up that you need to look for and be aware of. And if, definitely if gallbladder becomes an issue, then I would, you can support the gallbladder with artichoke extracts and things like that to try to help it. You can do digestive enzymes, but, wouldn't be a lot of harm in coming down on the fat just a little bit. There's no reason not to. But by far and away, the biggest problem with these high-fat diets is the constipation. You need to make sure that you get fiber in there and that you take care of gut health in other ways, like making sure they get adequate magnesium and probiotics and they drink a lot of water. And, ketogenic, low-carb type diets, a lot of people still eat dairy, and again, it doesn't, just because they're doing this type of diet, you still, again, have to make sure you explore what they're actually taking in. If they're having some, health issues that are related around that immune response to foods, food sensitivities, you might need to do some elimination. So this is a summary. The other thing is, if it's true ketogenic and they're not eating a lot of plant, foods, they're not eating a lot of fruit and non-starchy vegetables, that's going to limit the antioxidants and other anti-inflammatory phytonutrients that are in all those plant foods. And that's where, maybe using some of those Spectra Reds type dietary supplements can help the overall intake of different nutrients. So, ketogenic, it's all the rage. We're seeing people coming in now that have been loading up, doing those bulletproof executive coffees loaded up with coconut oil and ghee and all this. And it's increasing their lipids. We're seeing lipid profiles get worse on this. So while I know that, coconut oil has some advantages in that, you can use it for things like tooth pulling. You can, it's a fat that tolerates heat, so it's great for stir fries, the high heat type cooking. The big thing that I will say is that, it's the same old story even with fat. So low carb, higher fat is metabolically better for the vast majority of people in terms of managing weight, managing overall, blood glucose, insulin, all of that. But when people over time really increase their fat intake, and especially, like, I'll say this, fat intake from things like cheeses, they will begin to put on weight over time again. So the weight will slowly start to creep up, and it's really truly still comes down to the balance between activity level and intake of calories. So, we teach that, you can take in a few more calories on a low-carb diet, and that is true, but our bodies don't have unlimited capacity to just take in calorie from all this fat. Over time, it will tend to put weight back on, and especially with this really ramped up intake of coconut oil, I've seen deterioration of, lipid profiles. So LDL and total cholesterol and things really getting out of whack. Okay, my final point I want to make on these two diets. We are really keeping an eye, there's a massive amount of research being done on the effect of our nutrients, the foods we take in, and how it impacts our gut flora. So the two big phyla of gut flora are bacteroids, they used to call it bacteroidetes, gram-negative phyla of bacteria, and Firmicutes, the other big phyla, which is gram-positive. What some studies a few years ago found is that between these two main phyla of bacteria, they found a trend, and that was that the bacteroids are very low in obese subjects and were significantly higher in lean subjects, whereas the Firmicutes were very high in obese subjects, and not low, but say 25% lower in lean subjects. So they speculated then, well, why would this be? Why would one type of bacteria tend to be found in, maybe possibly helping people be more lean, not become overweight? And what they found is that Firmicutes and bacteroids have different involvement in energy resorption. So Firmicutes being higher, it's a higher energy resorption. You get more energy out of foods that get broken down by Firmicutes, versus bacteroids. So having more optimal levels could help people manage their weight better. So this was really groundbreaking research. So what last month I talked about a study that looked at factors that predisposed people to an elevated postprandial glycemic response. And what that study found was that proteobacteria and enterobacteriaceae, and I'm not sure I'm saying that right, were two types of gut organisms that were associated with an elevated response to high carbohydrate foods. So what they're looking at is they're looking to say, what are the factors that tend to make people have such an elevated glycemic response versus others that can eat the same amount of carb and the blood sugar levels don't go up nearly as high. And they even honed it down to gut flora having an impact. So how does this relate to our topic tonight? Okay. What they found was that high-fat, low-fiber diets, so it would be a ketogenic type diet, is a type of diet that led to increased bacteroides and increased actinobacteria. So this was another organism that was associated with elevated postprandial glycemic response. So high-fat diets tend to make us, over time, become less tolerant of high glycemic foods if they lead to these types of changes. One of the other things that a high-fat diet did was it reduced bifidobacterium in the gut, and of course that's a beneficial flora, and we don't want that reducing. And because the bacteroides went up, so did lipopolysaccharide production. And as we know now, lipopolysaccharide from bacteria in the gut migrating into the bloodstream is a factor that's involved in heart disease, and it's very pro-inflammatory. Interesting that a high-fat, high-sugar diet decreases bacteroids. So that's not a favorable effect. Okay, anyway, back to our high-fat, low-fiber causing an increase in these types of gut organisms that lead to reduced insulin sensitivity and elevated glycemic response to high-carb foods. So, and this is something that I've definitely seen in practice. I have definitely seen, after doing low-carb diet for a while, people seem to become less tolerant to carbs. And, you've got to work to get that sensitivity back. One of the things that I saw in a study somewhere as I was reading all this, I believe, is that if people are going to do low carb, higher fat, one of the ways they can help protect against these negative changes in gut organisms is to make sure to take in plenty of fiber. And that seems to help protect. So, and high fiber, low fat diets, definitely all those prebiotic fibers and all those plant foods and the resistant starches are a beneficial effect on gut health overall. They feed the beneficial flora. They improve maintenance of our enterocytes, staying healthy and well, and the function of those enterocytes. It builds up our mucin layer. So all the gut integrity issues improve on a higher fiber, low fat diet. High fiber, low fat diets led to an increase in a type of gut bacteria called Prevotella, an enterotype bacteria. This is actually may have some advantages. I'm not real studied on it yet, but one of the things that I did read in the literature that was of interest to me is that Prevotella is a gut organism that correlates with susceptibility to rheumatoid arthritis. So over time we may see things like, we do see increased prevalence of rheumatoid in vegetarian, high fiber, low fat eaters. We don't know. This will all continue to get flushed out over time, but I want you to be aware that one of the possible negative consequences of a high fat, low carb diet, especially if we're not making sure to take in enough fiber, is that it can make you less able to process glucose over time, and so you want to protect against that. And I did read in the literature, I believe as well, that things like taking a probiotic could help protect against these. So that's it. That's our review of low-fat plant-based diets and ketogenic diets. As you know, we are the makers of diet materials for practitioners for healthy diet and lifestyle, our Metabolic Code diet, and we have it available in our lifestyle guidance portal, and it's there to be an approach to ferreting out one's best, the diet that will be best for the individual person. So even though we have certain things built into the diet, one of the features of the Metabolic Code diet is that, yes, it's very high plant food intake, but we do have daily animal protein. It's a low glycemic load diet because it's got all those plant foods and it's low glycemic load. It's anti-inflammatory. The other thing that's built into it is this ability for people to figure out if food sensitivities are playing a role in their health. So it's the combination of being low glycemic plus helping people understand immune response to foods and what that can do to your health if it's going on. And of course, the other thing that's emphasized in our diet is we think it's helpful to eat as organic or low chemical, sustainably raised foods as much as possible, because we know that the harmful effects of some of those pesticides, the common pesticides, are things like interfering with thyroid and creating insulin resistance, the very things that we're trying to correct. So why would we keep taking in chemicals that could be negatively impacting us metabolically? So that's what we've built into the diet that we have available on the Lifestyle Guidance Portal. We encourage you, if you're not yet familiar with it, to take a look at the diet materials. We also have ability to give people exercise programs. So it's a very fast, easy way for a practitioner to get a client going on down a road that they need to be doing with exploring healthier diet for themselves and taking measures to increase their activity. So it's meant to free up you as practitioners and give you easier ways to do diet and lifestyle with your clients. So we encourage you to take a look at it, get involved, do one of our demos if you're not using it already. Thank you so much for taking all your time and attending tonight. We really appreciate it. And for my next webinar, I will be doing a review of superfoods. So you see these headlines in magazines all the time: goji berry, acai, maca, all of these new foods that are, tropical and exotic. And what do they really do for us? Do they really help, or is it a lot of hype? What could we possibly get from superfoods if we emphasize them? It's just a topic I've been wanting to do for a while, so we'll be talking all about that next time. And again, I thank you so much for joining us. And I'm seeing here where we have a couple of questions. One of them is on coconut oil, and I'm being asked to expound upon it for things like tooth pulling. Yes, it's wonderful for tooth pulling. It is effective. There are certain features of some of the fatty acids in coconut oil that are beneficial to health. For example, it's a source of caprylic acid, which has antifungal activity. But in general, it is, and as I said, it's very tolerant of high heat, so that's good for cooking. But my finding on it over the years has been excessive intake of it, it can elevate cholesterol and LDL in some people. So if I know people use coconut oil, I watch for that. We do in our practice. Another question is my opinion on very low calorie diets. What is too low? What is the safest calorie level? In relation to also what about HCG diets? So my take on very low calorie diets is that you never want to do a very low calorie diet without HCG. In fact, we've done HCG diets, we still use them sometimes, and it does appear that the HCG is effective at helping bypass the mechanism in the brain that makes people go into a metabolically less active state when they cut down super low on calories. So your metabolism just slows way down. And the HCG does seem to be effective at counteracting that. So it is the one way to do a very low calorie diet. On our HCG diets, we don't use the old 500 calorie level. I think most people who still do HCG do not use that level. They use more like 800 to 1,000 calories, and that's what we do, 800 calorie. But I would never do an 800 calorie diet without HCG. The literature is very, very clear. There are too many negative effects on hunger hormones when you go under 1,000 calories. So in general, for a person not doing HCG, we try not to go under 1,200. And that's what we've seen from the literature and from practice. I rarely have to go under 1,200 calories when the diet especially is built to be low carb. So anyway, that's it for tonight, and we hope we will see you back next month. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Mom.
Sorry about Lloyd.
Wow.
Trying to get him the frick out of here. But, yep. So there you go. All done.